lecture video is going to go over the anatomy of blood vessels, including arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. So when we look at the path that blood flows through our different vessels, we know that from a heart unit that the aorta is going to be that first vessel that's going to carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. So and we talked about the different vessels, the anatomy of the vessels, all of those vessels or arteries are going to branch out from the aorta at various points. So we started really with the aorta, and then that's going to branch into structures called arteries. Arteries will then branch into smaller structures called arterioles, which will then branch into the smallest of vessels, which are capillaries. Capillaries then will branch into slightly larger vessels, moving the blood back towards the heart. So arteries, arterioles are all moving blood away from the heart into structures called venules, and then those venules will eventually branch or combine to form veins. And then veins, all of the veins will eventually lead back to the vena cava, which will be taking all of that blood, oxygen poor blood, back into the heart. So a couple characteristics are about blood vessels. So really when we talk about blood vessels, we think about arteries and veins. And there are some things that arteries and veins actually have in common. One of the things is that all arteries and veins have a lumen, and that's going to be that opening in the vessel where the blood's going to flow. The lumen is a little bit different in arteries and veins, but they both do have that, which is obvious because that's the place blood flows through. All arteries and veins have three distinct tissue layers, and they vary in thickness between arteries, veins, arterioles, venules, capillaries, but all three of these layers are there. The outermost layer is the tunica externa, and this is typically going to be made of connective tissues, including collagen and elastic fibers. The middle layer is the tunica media. You can see that right here. This is typically going to be made up of smooth muscle and elastic fibers, and this is the tissue layer that will be responsible for allowing blood vessels to get bigger, to dilate, or to get smaller, constrict. And then the tunica intima is this internal most layer that would actually be abutting the lumen. So you can kind of see right here this intima, also called the interna, and this is typically going to be made up of simple squamous and some smooth muscle. So you actually have a lot of different types of tissues that can be found within the arteries or within the arteries and veins, the blood vessels. You got muscle tissue, you've got epithelial tissue, and then you also have connective tissue. So it's kind of a cool little organ where you can see all three different types of layers. So looking at some differences between arteries and veins, arteries are going to be thicker. So again, you can see how much thicker arteries are than veins, and that's because pressure of blood is much stronger in an artery than a vein. Arteries can withstand more pressure, and that's because they're structurally thicker. Arteries have smaller lumens because they have quite a bit more of that tunica media. This is going to allow the lumen to actually look a lot more rounded if we were looking at tissue samples of arteries and veins than in a vein. Veins typically look a little bit more flat. And then veins have valves, and that's going to help prevent the flow from gravity pushing the blood back down to our feet. We want blood to keep going up to the heart, so there are valves that exist in the veins to kind of keep the blood flowing in one direction. So looking at the flow of blood, again, we got arteries to arterioles to something called metarterioles. Arteries take blood away from the heart. Again, they have a very thick wall because the blood traveling through them is under high pressure. Arterioles are going to be smaller than arteries. Their job is to essentially slow down the blood flow as it starts to reach the capillaries. It's also going to be the site of blood pressure regulation. And then the metarterioles are going to be structures that are kind of a transition between the arterioles and the capillaries. They have characteristics of both of them, and there are sphincters in these vessels that are going to again regulate the blood flow into the capillary and the capillary beds. So all of the blood flowing through these structures are carrying blood away from the heart, and in most cases oxygen rich blood. Then we get to capillaries, okay? So capillaries will then be the smallest of blood vessels. This is going to be the site of nutrient and waste exchange, also the site of perfusion. And so when we talk about perfusion, we're talking about supplying blood to tissues. Blood that's flowing through capillaries are called, or is referred to as microcirculation, because these are so incredibly small. And one of the interesting characteristics of capillaries is that they are leaky, so they will allow substances to pass into and out of. There are actually 3 categories of capillaries, and depending on which category we are will depend on what can actually leak through the different categories of capillaries. So for instance, the first kind is a continuous capillary. So in a continuous capillary, there is it has a complete endothelial lining, and there are tight junctions between the different cells that make up that lining, but those junctions are kind of incomplete, and there are these little gaps that exist then, and they're going to allow small molecules to kind of come into and out of the capillary. So that might include water, glucose, hormones, and so it will allow those things to exchange from inside the capillary to outside in that interstitial fluid. The fenestrated capillary is the next kind. This is going to have pores that are just a little bit bigger, and then they also have those incomplete gap junctions, so they will allow slightly larger molecules to pass through. And then the sinusoid capillaries are going to, we kind of call these the Swiss cheese of the capillaries, because they're going to be very flat. They're going to have lots of openings in them, and they're going to allow really large molecules to leak between the capillary and the interstitial fluid, like plasma proteins. So proteins are really large. These are going to be the capillaries that will allow proteins to come into and out of the capillary, or into and out of the interstitial fluid. The capillaries will then branch into venules. These are going to be smaller versions of veins, and then those venules will eventually combine to form veins. Veins have thin walls because they are under a lot lower pressure than arteries do. So actually, if you were able to close your eyes and feel an artery and a vein, like rub them between your fingers, you would easily be able to tell the difference between the artery and the vein. The veins are just much thinner. They have a larger lumen, so because of that, oftentimes under a microscope, they look kind of flat. Their job is to carry blood back to the heart and eventually dump that blood into the vena cava, where it will then enter into the heart. And because though veins have to fight off gravity, they are going to have valves in them, which will then keep the blood moving up towards the heart in order for blood not to just settle down in our feet. An important part of a vein is that it is an important blood reservoir in our body. So 64% of our blood volume at any given moment is going to be contained within our veins. So that's kind of the anatomy of arteries, veins, and capillaries.